The harsh fluorescent lights of Mario's diner cut through the autumn darkness as Sarah Martinez, a woman in her mid-60s wearing threadbare clothes, pressed her worn hands against the glass window, watching diners finish their meals. Her eyes followed each morsel of food left on their plates, her own stomach cramping with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and desperation had driven her to this moment. Watching, waiting, hoping. Inside, celebrity podcast host Joe Rogan sat at his usual corner booth, engaged in an animated discussion with his friend about the transformative power of martial arts, when the commotion near the entrance caught his attention. The waitress, Lisa, was confronting Sarah, who had finally gathered the courage to step inside. "Trees," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not asking for money, just the leftovers that would go to waste anyway." Lisa's face hardened as she gripped her ordering pad tighter. "Ma'am, we don't do that here. You need to leave now, or I'll have to call the police." The diner fell silent. Every head turned to watch the scene unfold, but no one moved to help. No one except Joe Rogan. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about acts of kindness and humanity, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Joe set down his coffee cup and studied the scene before him, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. Sarah's clothes were clean but worn thin, her gray hair neatly combed despite her circumstances. This wasn't someone looking for an easy handout. This was someone who had fallen on hard times and was fighting to maintain her dignity. Rising from his booth, Joe approached the two women. The waitress's eyes widened in recognition, but before she could speak, he raised his hand gently. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice carrying the same thoughtful intensity that had made him famous. "Let's talk about this." Turning to Sarah, he asked, "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she answered honestly. 2 days ago at the shelter, but they're overcrowded now and I—" Her voice trailed off, the shame of her situation weighing heavily. Joe nodded, understanding filling his features. He'd come from humble beginnings himself and had never forgotten the lessons those early struggles taught him. "Misa," he addressed the waitress, "I'd like to buy this lady dinner. Actually, make that dinner for everyone in the diner right now." A murmur of surprise rippled through the restaurant. Lisa's stern expression melted into uncertainty. "Mr. Rogan, that's very generous, but our policy about—" "Sometimes policies need to be reconsidered," Joe interrupted, but his tone remained kind. "Sometimes we need to look at the bigger picture. This isn't just about food. It's about humanity." He turned to address the other diners, his voice carrying the same passionate conviction that had made his podcast the most popular in the world. "You know, I've spent years talking to people from all walks of life on my show. The one thing I've learned is that anyone can fall on hard times. Anyone. The measure of a society isn't how we treat people at their best. It's how we treat them at their worst." The diner had fallen completely silent. Every eye fixed on Joe as he continued. "What if this was your mother, your grandmother? Would you want someone to show them kindness?" Sarah stood trembling, tears now flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. Joe gently guided her to his booth. "Please sit down. Let's talk while we wait for your meal." As Sarah settled into the booth, Joe waved Lisa over. "Let's start with a hot cup of coffee and the full breakfast special. Extra bacon." He smiled warmly at Sarah. "Take your time. There's no rush here." What happened next would transform Mario's diner forever. As other customers watched Joe Rogan, one of the most influential voices in media, sit down with a homeless woman and listen to her story with genuine interest, something shifted in the atmosphere. Phone cameras captured the moment, not with intrusive sensationalism, but with quiet reverence. Sarah's story unfolded between sips of coffee and bites of the first hot meal she'd had in days. She had been a schoolteacher for 30 years before a series of medical bills depleted her savings. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, and their modest pension wasn't enough to cover the mounting costs. One setback led to another, and eventually, she found herself on the streets. "You know what the hardest part is?" she confided, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug. "It's not the hunger or the cold. is feeling invisible. People look right through you, like you're not even human anymore. Joe leaned forward. His normally animated demeanor softened with compassion. You're not invisible anymore, Sarah. Not today, not ever again. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Within minutes, he had connected with local homeless advocacy groups he'd previously worked with. But Joe didn't stop there. He shared Sarah's story on his podcast the next day, using his platform not to highlight his own actions, but to discuss the larger issues of elderly poverty and the broken healthcare system that had led to her situation. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Listeners from across the country reached out, sharing similar stories and offering support. Local businesses near Mario's Diner began implementing suspended meal programs, where customers could prepay for meals that would be available to those in need. The diner itself, under Lisa's surprisingly enthusiastic leadership, became a pioneer in the movement. Lisa, who had initially tried to remove Sarah from the premises, underwent the most remarkable transformation. The incident had forced her to confront her own prejudices and fear. She approached Joe before he left that night, her voice thick with emotion. "I've worked here for 12 years, she admitted. I've turned away so many people, thinking I was doing my job, protecting the business. I never stopped to really see them as people." Joe's response was characteristic of his approach to life and conversation. Thoughtful and direct. The beautiful thing about mistakes is that they're teachers. They show us where we need to grow. What matters is what we do with that knowledge. As word of what happened that night spread, Mario's Diner became a symbol of hope and transformation in the community. Regular customers began leaving extra money to cover meals for those in need. Local businesses started donating supplies and resources to support the initiative. Even the diner's owner, Mario himself, was moved by the change he witnessed in his establishment. Mario, a second-generation immigrant who had built the diner from scratch, pulled Joe aside during one of his regular visits. "You know, when my father opened this place in 1962, he always said a restaurant should be more than just a business. It should be a heart of the community. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. You helped us remember." The story caught the attention of local media, then national outlets. But unlike many viral moments that fade quickly, this one had staying power because it wasn't just about one night or one act of kindness. It was about sustainable change and community transformation. Joe used his platform to amplify the message, but he was careful to keep the focus on the larger issues at play. During one particularly powerful podcast episode, he hosted Sarah alongside experts in elderly poverty and healthcare reform. The resulting discussion sparked a nationwide conversation about the challenges facing America's aging population. "It's not enough to just feel bad about these situations," Joe said during the episode. "We need to understand how they happen and work to prevent them. Every person has value, has a story, has something to contribute to society. When we forget that, we all lose." Sarah's personal transformation was equally remarkable. With the support of the community and the resources Joe had helped to connect her with, she found stable housing and began working part-time at a local community center, helping others navigate the social services system she had come to know so well. But perhaps the most profound change was in how she carried herself. The shame and invisibility she had felt that night at the diner had been replaced by a quiet dignity and sense of purpose. She became a powerful advocate for others in similar situations, speaking at community meetings and working with local officials to improve services for the elderly and homeless. 6 months after that fateful night, Mario's Diner hosted a community celebration. The once dark restaurant had been transformed, both physically and spiritually. Warm string lights now decorated the windows, and a new sign proudly displayed their commitment to community service. Where every person matters. The celebration brought together an unlikely mix of people: regular customers, local business owners, social workers, and members of the homeless community. They shared meals and stories, breaking down the invisible barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable. Joe attended quietly, preferring to watch from a corner booth as the community he had helped catalyze continued to grow and evolve. Sarah found him there, sliding into the seat across from him with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "You know what I've learned?" she said. gesturing to the diverse crowd filling the diner. Sometimes it takes just one person willing to see you, really see you, to help you remember who you are. Joe smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. That's the thing about human connection, he replied. It works both ways. When we truly see others, we often end up seeing ourselves more clearly too. The conversation was interrupted by Lisa, now the diner's manager, announcing the launch of their latest initiative, a mentorship program pairing elderly community members with local youth, sharing skills and stories across generations. Sarah had been instrumental in developing the program, drawing on her years of teaching experience. As the evening wound down, Joe found himself reflecting on the ripple effects of that single moment of intervention. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something far more significant, a movement that was changing lives and challenging assumptions about community, dignity, and the power of human connection. The story of Mario's Diner and Sarah Martinez became more than just a viral moment or a heartwarming anecdote. It became a blueprint for community transformation, showing how small acts of kindness and recognition could spark lasting change. Local business associations began studying the Mario's model, as it came to be known, implementing similar programs in their own communities. But beyond the programs and initiatives, the real legacy was in the countless small moments of connection that now happened daily. The elderly man who no longer ate alone because other customers had learned to invite him to their tables. The young waitress who had learned to look past appearances and see the humanity in every person who walked through the door. The businessman who now kept extra meal vouchers in his pocket to share with those in need. Joe Rogan's influence had been crucial in catalyzing these changes, but his greatest contribution had been showing people that it was okay to care, to get involved, to see the humanity in everyone. His podcast continued to feature stories of community transformation and social change, but he always pointed back to the simple truth he had demonstrated that night. Real change begins with really seeing each other. As the one-year anniversary of that transformative night approached, Sarah sat in her small but comfortable apartment, writing in her journal. She had started keeping a record of the changes she witnessed, the lives touched, the barriers broken down. Her words captured the essence of what had happened. 1 year ago, I was invisible. Today I see and am seen. 1 year ago I was hungry for food. Today, I am nourished by purpose and community. 1 year ago, a man famous for his voice used it to help others hear mine. Today, we all speak for each other. The story of Mario's Diner continues to inspire similar transformations across the country. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the simplest actions. Seeing someone who feels invisible, extending a hand to someone who feels alone, and showing others that it's okay to do the same. Joe Rogan's legacy in this story isn't just about the immediate help he provided or even the systemic changes he helped inspire. It's about the example he set, showing that influence and platform can be used to uplift others, that compassion isn't weakness, and that real strength lies in our ability to see and acknowledge the humanity in everyone we meet. The fluorescent lights of Mario's Diner still shine through the darkness, but now they illuminate a very different scene. Where once there was judgment and separation, there is now connection and community. Where there was invisibility, there is now recognition. And in this transformation lies a powerful truth. When we choose to truly see each other, we all become more visible, more human. Noshi. The story of Mario's Diner became a beacon of hope, illustrating how one moment of compassion could spark lasting change. Joe Rogan's podcast devoted an entire series to exploring similar transformations happening across the country, featuring stories of communities coming together to support their most vulnerable members. During one particularly memorable episode, Joe hosted a panel of community leaders who had implemented similar programs in their cities. What happened at Mario's Diner wasn't just about feeding people, he explained to his millions of listeners. It was about recognizing the dignity in every human being. When we do that, we create the foundation for real, lasting change. The impact continued to ripple outward. Social workers began using the Mario's model as a case study in community transformation. Business schools incorporated it into their ethics curriculum, examining how social responsibility and profitable business practices could coexist and thrive together. Sarah's role in the story evolved as well. She became a sought-after speaker at community organizations and social work conferences, sharing her unique perspective on both experiencing and overcoming invisibility. Her journey from educator to homeless woman to community leader offered powerful insights into the complexity of social issues and the importance of maintaining human dignity. People often ask me if I'm angry about what happened to me, she would tell her audiences. But I've learned that anger doesn't create change, connection does. What Joe Rogan did that night wasn't just buy me dinner. He showed an entire community how to see people differently, and in doing so, he helped us all see ourselves differently too. The transformation of Lisa, the waitress, became another powerful thread in the story. She emerged as a fierce advocate for compassionate business practices, consulting with other restaurants and businesses about implementing similar programs. Her first-hand experience with shifting from judgment to understanding made her an effective messenger for change. I used to think my job was to protect the business from people like Sarah, she would explain during training sessions. Now I understand that my real job is to protect people's dignity while running a successful business. Thanks to Joe Rogan's example, I learned these aren't mutually exclusive goals. Mario's Diner itself continued to evolve. The owner installed a community board where people could post needs and offers of help. Regular customers began forming relationships with people they might never have spoken to before. The diner became a model for how businesses could serve as bridges between different segments of the community. Joe Rogan's influence remained subtle but significant. He would stop by the diner when he was in town, sitting in his usual booth and engaging in conversations with whoever happened to be there. He never sought recognition for his role in the transformation, preferring instead to highlight the ongoing work of people like Sarah and Lisa. During one of these visits, almost 2 years after the initial incident, he found himself in a conversation with a young business student who was studying the diner's transformation. The student asked him why he had chosen to intervene that night. Joe's response captured the essence of what made his action so powerful. You know, I've had the privilege of talking to some of the most interesting people in the world on my podcast. Scientists, athletes, philosophers, or you name it. And one thing I've learned is that wisdom can come from anywhere. That night, I saw someone who needed to be heard. Really heard. Sometimes that's all it takes to start a revolution of kindness. The revolution of kindness he spoke of continued to spread. Other cities began implementing their own versions of the program, each adapted to their unique community needs. The "Nobody Goes Hungry Here" signs became a symbol of hope and community commitment across the country. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the everyday interactions that took place at Mario's Diner and beyond. The simple act of acknowledging another person's humanity, of really seeing them, became a habit that spread from person to person, creating countless small moments of connection and understanding. As the story continued to inspire change, Joe Rogan occasionally reflected on it during his podcast episodes, using it as a launching point for deeper discussions about community, compassion, and human dignity. The beautiful thing about kindness, he would say, is that it's contagious. When people see it in action, they want to be part of it. They want to create more of it. The legacy of that night at Mario's Diner lives on not just in the programs it inspired or the lives it changed, but in the way it continues to challenge us all to look deeper, to see the humanity in every face we encounter, and to remember that we all have the power to transform moments of judgment into opportunities for connection and compassion. Today, Mario's Diner still stands as a testament to the power of human connection and the ripple effects of kindness. The fluorescent lights still shine through the darkness, but now they illuminate a community where no one has to feel invisible, where dignity is served alongside daily specials, and where Joe Rogan's simple act of compassion continues to inspire new acts of kindness every day. The story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the simplest actions. Seeing someone who feels invisible, extending a hand to someone who feels alone, and showing others that it's okay to do the same. In doing so, we don't just help others, we help ourselves remember our own humanity and our connection to the broader human family. As Joe Rogan often says on his podcast, the measure of a society isn't in its technological advances or economic metrics. It's in how we treat each other, especially those who need our help the most. The story of that night at Mario's Diner, and everything that followed, stands as a powerful testament to that truth. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn evening much like the one when this story began, Mario's Diner hosted a special anniversary celebration. The restaurant was packed with familiar faces. Sarah, now running a successful mentorship program for homeless seniors. Misa, who had become a nationally recognized advocate for community-based business practices. And dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the movement that started there. Joe Rogan arrived quietly, just as he had done countless times before. As he took his usual seat in the corner booth, Sarah approached with 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, settling into the seat across from him, "someone asked me recently what I remembered most about that night 5 years ago. Want to know what I told them?" Joe leaned forward, his eyes showing the same genuine interest they had shown that first night. "What did you say?" "I told them that in all my years of teaching, I never had a lesson as powerful as the one you taught everyone that night. That sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply seeing someone when the rest of the world has looked away." Joe smiled, his characteristic humility showing through. "The real courage was yours, Sarah. You were willing to be seen at your most vulnerable moment. That's what gave everyone else permission to open their hearts." As the evening wound down, the diner's new neon sign cast a warm glow over the street outside. It read Mario's Diner, where everyone is seen. Know it. A smaller sign displayed the words that had started a nationwide movement. "Nobody goes hungry here." Inside, the walls were now covered with photographs, hundreds of moments of connection and kindness that had taken place within these walls. At the center was a simple snapshot from that first night. Joe Rogan and Sarah, sharing a meal and a conversation that would change countless lives. The story of Mario's Diner reminds us that true change doesn't always require grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as seeing someone who feels invisible, sharing a meal with someone who is hungry, or showing others that it's okay to care. And sometimes, the greatest legacy we can leave is teaching others how to see the humanity in everyone they meet. As Joe left the diner that night, he paused at the door, looking back at the vibrant community that had grown from that single moment of compassion. A small smile crossed his face as he remembered something he often told his podcast listeners. In a world where you can be anything, be someone who makes others feel seen. That night at Mario's Diner, he had done exactly that. And in doing so, he had helped countless others learn to do the same.